Hey, what's up, house groups? So the other day, I was reading an article about a guy who was hiking and he came across a cocoon of an emperor moth, which he thought was pretty cool. So he took it home to watch the moth hatch. I don't know if hatching is the official term, but that's the concept. And after a few days, a small hole appeared in the cocoon. And so he watched and he waited for it to get out. But for hours and hours and hours, nothing happened and the hole didn't get any bigger. And it became clear that the moth was stuck. It just couldn't get past this one point. And so he grabbed a pair of scissors and very carefully snipped the cocoon a little bit. And then progress started to happen. And eventually the moth flopped out of there with a swollen body and these tiny shriveled wings. And he assumed that after a few hours, the wings would take shape and the moth would begin to fly. But after a few hours, nothing happened. And he left and he came back the next day and still it had this swollen body and these little shriveled wings. And so he called a friend who knew more about it, and his friend told him the bad news. See, it turns out that the tiny opening and the long struggle to squeeze through it is actually God's incredibly clever way of forcing liquid out of the moth's body into the moth's wings so that they grow and take shape. And so his merciful snip had, in the end, been cruel. He meant to help the moth survive, but what he did was cut off the moth from the beautiful potential it was created for. It turned out the struggle is what the moth needed in order to take shape. I think that same thing is true for us as well, maybe even more so than it is for the moth. In Romans 5, Paul tells us that we should glory, that we should rejoice, that we should boast in our suffering. Because suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. And if you're anything like me, you read that and you think, oh man, I want more perseverance in my life. I want more character in my life. I want more hope in my life. If anything, 2020, the last year, has shown me that I did not have enough perseverance or character or hope. And I want more of those things. I think all of us do, but we certainly don't want suffering to be the pathway that gets us there. I mean, that very idea of like suffering so that we can grow is radically countercultural in 21st century America. We live in a society that's obsessed with comfort and ease and amusement. We're surrounded by wealth and simplicity and all of this stuff that's meant to make our lives easier and meant to make sure that we never have to struggle and we never have to suffer. But I look at our world, I look at America right now, and I see a society that is failing in basically every important measure of human flourishing. Despite the fact that we have more wealth and more ease and more comfort than any society in the history of the world. And I think there are a whole lot of reasons for that, but I think that one of them is our passionate avoidance of all suffering. On Sunday during the sermon, my friend David Soren said, when we avoid suffering, or in our quest to avoid suffering, we end up avoiding God. And if you haven't watched the sermon, I would encourage you, go back and watch it. It was really phenomenal, but that quote has kind of been haunting me. In our quest to avoid suffering, we end up avoiding God. We end up missing out on everything that He can do in our lives and through our lives. When we go through hardship, when we find ourselves in a point where we're so empty, we know that we have to rely on Him. And David also talked about this concept of a suffering muscle. He said so often we avoid hardship and we make sure that our kids never have to suffer and never have to face any obstacles. And what we end up with is a really weak suffering muscle where all that happens every time anything doesn't go perfect for us is that we doubt God rather than run to Him and rely on Him. But what if in the middle of hard times, what if in the middle of a season of life that's been really difficult, instead of doubting God, we trusted that God was doing something in and through us? What if we worked out our suffering muscle a little bit? I think what we would find is that Paul's right. We can rejoice, we can glory, we can boast in the difficulties and the obstacles and the struggles that we face, because in the middle of those, God does not abandon us. He doesn't leave us there. He does something inside of us. He produces perseverance and character and hope in a way that absolutely shapes us into the beautiful futures he has for us and allows us to make a difference in the world around us. Like, suffering's going nowhere. Life is never going to be as easy as we wish it was. But in the middle of all that, what I want to encourage you to do as we move forward, not just this week, but this month and this year in 2021, is to let God exercise your suffering muscle a little bit and trust that in the middle of life not always being the way that we want it to be, God is moving and God wants to do big things in and through our lives.